In this very in-depth forecast, the northern plains are currently being monitored for severe weather as a mix of isolated and linear storms could harbor the potential for widespread damaging wind gusts greater than 70 miles per hour, widespread massive hail greater than 2 inches, and a couple of tornadoes being possible. Everything you need to know on Project Gladiator. Hello everyone, welcome back to another Project Gladiator weather forecast. Today I'll be covering the weather for June 27th of 2024. For today, we have an enhanced risk for the northern high plains and even into portions of Montana there. This enhanced risk includes western portions of Nebraska, western portions of South Dakota, eastern portions of Montana, and western portions of North Dakota. We also do have an additional slight risk for portions of the Rockies here for western Colorado and central into eastern Utah there. We will be primarily covering this enhanced risk for today. We also do have a marginal risk for portions of the eastern coastline here for North Dakota, South Dakota, and Georgia. Risks for today do include a 5% tornado risk for that enhanced risk region, where we could see the potential for a couple of tornadoes. A 30% damaging wind risk with the possibility of significant damaging wind gusts being greater than 70 miles per hour across this region. This risk for damaging wind gusts will be the primary driver for the enhanced risk region. On top of this 30% hail risk, which will also drive that enhanced risk region, but the tornado risk definitely being a little bit more on the back burner for today compared to our damaging wind risk and our hail risk, but still definitely a really big thing. Today's risk for severe thunderstorms that you should keep an eye out for, even if that wind and hail risk is going to be higher. And as for our hail risk, we do have a 30% risk for some large hail with the possibility of widespread massive hailstones being greater than 2 inches across this region. For tomorrow, we do have a slight risk for the central plains into portions of the Mississippi River valleys and the Midwest there. This does include southern Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, northeastern Colorado, southeastern Wyoming, and Nebraska. Risks for tomorrow do include a 5% tornado risk for portions of northeastern Kansas, southeastern Nebraska, southwestern Iowa, and northwestern Missouri there. As for our damaging wind risk, we do have a 15% with a little bit further off to the west for Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, and Wyoming, where we could see the potential for some significant damaging wind gusts being greater than 70 miles per hour. We also do have a 15% hail risk, including the possibility of some widespread hailstones being greater than 2 inches across western portions of that 15% risk. Into Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado, and Kansas. For day 3 outlook, we do have a pretty large marginal risk that extends across the New England corridor, the Ohio River Valley, and all the way back into the high plains in Colorado and northeastern New Mexico, with a slight risk for Ohio, northern West Virginia, and western Pennsylvania, where we could see the potential of some upcoming scattered severe thunderstorms. Then for day 4, day 8 outlook, we do have a day 4 15% for the high plains, for western North Dakota and eastern Montana, where we are monitoring for the possibility of some upcoming significant severe thunderstorms, as well as a 15% for the central plains for South Dakota and Nebraska, where we are also monitoring for the potential of some significant severe thunderstorms upcoming. Taking a look at our weather models, starting off with our 500 millibars and our surface observations and how those are going to work in conjunction to support the risk for severe thunderstorms for today. Starting off with our upper air pattern, we do have a trough that is currently propagating across the northern half of the United States here, and this is going to support the risk for severe thunderstorms with pretty widespread, pretty strong, decently strong 500 millibar flow here that will definitely support quite a lot of shear and quite a lot of lift and support that risk for severe thunderstorms overall. We are expected to see a lot of this flow at our 500 millibars translate down to our surface, and we do have a lot of moisture that is streaming out of the south, so that flow at the surface out of the west will push on all that moisture and create a little bit of a dry line. We won't really see too much of a very sharp dry line, but that dry line will definitely be there. Some storms across South Dakota and Nebraska could potentially fire along that dry line. However, we are expected to see our main thing, which is going to be a cold front that is going to slowly propagate with this trough here, and that is leading to some early activity further off to the west in Montana and Wyoming. as some general rain showers, some general thunderstorms, and maybe some gusty winds that aren't really going to pose too much of a severe hazard right now. However, as that cold front moves in and when surface heating is introduced across this region, that will heavily increase the temperature gradient along that cold front and increase the lift and overall just generally how much storms want to fire along that cold front with increased temperature gradient along that cold front and more forcing. So those two things will work together. That dry line again could have some storms fire along it. However, it isn't really the best dry line. It isn't really too sharp, and it is kind of messy. It's kind of mid. So storms may have a hard time firing along that dry line, but again, we could potentially see some storms fire along that dry line, particularly in an area that is good of good interest to me, where we do have a little bit of a dry line nose that is currently pushed inward across I think South Dakota and Nebraska here. Somewhere around this area we do have a little bit of a dry line nose. It is going to be further down to the south than where Retimmer is currently stationed. Pretty sure he is targeting around this area for today. May not even be in South Dakota, but we do have a dry line nose to the south, and that is definitely going to lead to overall a greater risk for severe thunderstorms, especially just on the dry line itself, because of the greater forcing along that dry line. If I was chasing today, I would be targeting along that dry line nose in South Dakota and Nebraska. If you are a storm chaser out in the field for today, I definitely suggest maybe keeping an eye on that dry line, especially if you are just going to be targeting the cold front. Taking a look at our 850 millibars and our low-level jet and how that's going to affect our risk for tornadoes across this region. This is where it gets a little bit confusing for today, because both our 850 millibar and our 700 millibar, both our low-level jet things, are they're kind of confusing, especially for today's risk for severe thunderstorms, because the low-level jet indicated by our high-resolution ensemble forecast is so far to the east that it's basically non-existent right now. I know that a lot of models are indicating a weaker low-level jet here. We can actually switch over to just our regular HRRR, our regular high-resolution models. That is just one of the high-resolution ensemble forecast members here, and that will kind of give us a better insight into what the rest of the models are kind of thinking for today, and how that's contributing to our high-resolution ensemble forecast. So you can see where our storms are. You can see where all that activity is across the Montana and North Dakota border there. But if you notice ahead of our storms, we have basically nothing as far as a low-level jet. So this is where it does become a little bit confusing as far as our risk for tornadoes. We are definitely expected to see a significantly more modest low-level jet across this region. We are still expected to see at least a little bit of curvature in the low levels of those photographs indicated here. However, we could definitely see a little bit more limited storm relative felicity as a result of a weaker low-level jet. And let me just jump the gun here really quickly. We can go look at our storm relative felicity really quickly before we actually look at it later in the video. We definitely have some really nice storm relative felicity values along that dry line ahead of our along our cold front, ahead of our storms, and even amongst a very weak low-level jet, we will definitely see sufficient storm relative felicity values that will be supportive of a tornado risk across this region. Taking a look at our 200 millibars and how that's going to affect our risk for severe thunderstorms overall, as well as our risk for hail with our speed shear, we have some really nice 200 millibar flow here. That isn't necessarily too defluent. It definitely does look like all our wind vectors are going to be following each other. It doesn't really look like we're going to see too much spread. However, that won't really affect our risk for severe thunderstorms that much. We shouldn't really see too much impact from it. It's usually if we do see some sort of defluence, then it's something to note. But if we don't see that much defluence, it's not really that big of a deal. As far as our 200 millibar flow goes, we do have some pretty strong 200 millibar flow, and that will definitely support some really strong bulk shear values across this region with 200 millibar flow that is definitely decently strong, upwards of 80 knots across this region. Again, it's not going to be too terribly strong, but we also do see some pretty decently strong 500 millibar flow. And overall, regardless, even if it isn't too necessarily extremely strong, if it's not in those 90 knots, that's fine. We will still see the potential for some massive hailstones across this region and elongated photographs and quite a lot of speed here, again supporting that massive hail risk. Taking a look at our 0 to 3 kilometer storm relative helicity and our directional shear and how that's going to affect our risk for tornadoes across this region. Again, this is where it does get a little bit confusing, but regardless, we are expected to see some pretty strong storm relative helicity values across this region. We are expected to see a decently sheared environment, in fact, a pretty strongly sheared environment. The majority of our strong storm relative helicity values will definitely be a little bit further off to the west, or sorry, to the east, where we will see a little bit more of a stronger low-level jet. However, we will definitely see a lot of overlap with our storms in this really strong storm relative helicity values. We do have yet to look at our most unstable Cape values and our energy helicity index values, which will show you where that directional shear and our instability overlaps. However, overall, we could definitely be in for a pretty big risk for tornadoes across this region, as this definitely seems to be a very, very decently sheared environment across this region. In fact, a strongly sheared environment again, with storm relative helicity values getting upwards of 2,000, or sorry, not 2,000, 200, even 300 in some regions. Again, definitely a really strongly sheared environment across this region. Again, just plentiful shear, and definitely a very good risk for tornadoes across this region as a result. Taking a look at our bulk shear values and how that's going to affect our risk for hail across this region, we are expected to see some really high bulk shear values across this region, with bulk shear values that are expected to get upwards of the 50 to 60 knots ahead of our storms. And again, that's definitely going to be a really, really well sheared environment across this region. And behind our storms, a lot of the same thing as well. Isn't going to be necessarily right up on our storms, directly backing our storms, but we will definitely see some pretty decently strong bulk shear values not too far away from our storms. That will definitely influence that hail risk, with bulk shear values that are going to be fairly similar behind our storms as ahead of them, around those 50, 60 knots, potentially even some 70 knots in some regions, indicated by a couple areas here. Especially later on, when storms move into more central western North Dakota there. Again, definitely a really, really well sheared environment. If we look at our photographs here, I'll try to get one that isn't contaminated. Yeah, this looks pretty good. So, mainly our photograph here. Very, very long, very, very straight, definitely a hail producing photograph here, very indicative of the potential for some massive hailstones. And as far as our thing here goes, I like to look at this because it's kind of like the instead of not horizontally, instead of vertically looking down at our photograph top down and looking how the parcel moves as it rises in the atmosphere from top down, this is kind of looking at the storm from the ground, if that makes sense. It's kind of hard for me to explain, but it's like if it's horizontally looking at the storm. I hope that's making sense. I don't know how to put it in any clearer words, but you can see how this red line tracks, and you can see how tilted it is in those mid levels, low levels, and even the upper levels here. A super well sheared environment goes well past the classic supercell marker here. So definitely a very well sheared environment, definitely going to be very conducive of some pretty mature supercells and the possibility for some massive hailstones across this region. I'm looking for our significant hail parameter here is up to 1.4. So again, very, very conducive for some massive hailstones across this region. Taking a look at our temperatures and how that's going to affect our instability across this region, we are expected to see some pretty hot temperatures across this region, with temperatures that are expected to get upwards of at least the low 90s there along the Montana to North Dakota border. By the time the temperatures do begin decreasing and the sun sets, we will see those drop a little bit more as storms continue along the cold front into western North Dakota. Definitely going to see some pretty warm temperatures. However, our storms will be moving through the middle of the enhanced risk before we begin to see our temperatures slowly begin to fall off as the sun sets. However, after the sun does set, we will see some pretty hot temperatures as that cold front continues to move through the enhanced risk region. Temperatures that are going to remain in the low 70s and the upper 60s across this region. And because it is summer, we will see prolonged instability, and definitely see quite a lot of instability as a result of some pretty warm temperatures across this region. However, as far as the overlap between our temperatures and where our instability is going to be, as well as our storm relative felicity values, again, not really talking about the dry line nose that well, or that much right now, but mainly focusing around the North Dakota, northern South Dakota, and Montana border region. By the time the sun does set and we lose those hot temperatures, our storms will be continuing through the middle of the enhanced risk region. We will still see some decently strong instability. It's not going to be as strong as what would be expected at high noon, before the sun is set. However, as storms continue eastward, they will encounter greater storm relative felicity and overall a greater potential for tornadoes. I think over the past couple of days, I have been kind of underestimating the impacts of the instability. So, even with those weaker instability values, we definitely have temperatures that will lead to prolonged instability across this region, and overall a prolonged risk for tornadoes, especially into the afternoon hours and even overnight as storms move through the second half of that enhanced risk region. So where we do see some pretty decently strong instability overlap with some even stronger storm relative velocity values as storms propagate further eastward, I think the best risk for tornadoes, again not focusing along that dry line nose, is going to be probably around this region, where we will still see some decent storm relative felicity values. It won't be as strong, but also where we will see some stronger instability and stronger updrafts, and potentially the possibility for maybe a significant tornado, especially with how strong those storm relative felicity values were that we looked at earlier. So that is where I think the best risk for tornadoes along the cold front may be. But again, if I was chasing today, I would definitely be chasing along that dry line nose, because overall we does look like we may have a little bit greater instability with some more widespread 90 degrees and even a little bit hotter temperatures as well, potentially reaching 95 there. And overall greater storm relative felicity values. If we hop back here to look at our 0 to 3 kilometer storm relative felicity, a little bit greater storm relative felicity values along that dry line nose. So I would definitely be chasing around the South Dakota Nebraska border, potentially even maybe a little bit to the north in South Dakota there. So that's where I would be chasing today, but I definitely would be watching central or western North Dakota along the Montana North Dakota border, and even into western North Dakota as well in the overnight hours. Taking a look at our dew points and how that's going to affect our instability, we are expected to see some pretty decently high dew point values across this region. Definitely not going to be anything too crazy with the widespread 70s, and we could even see more modest dew point values. Again, our high resolution ensemble forecast is a little bit more conservative. However, I definitely think that this may be right on the money with what a lot of other models have been indicating for our dew point values, with dew points that are expected to be around the low to mid 60s across this region, and higher dew point values across the Nebraska and South Dakota border there, where we could see a little bit greater instability with some greater dew point values and some larger moisture values. Definitely going to see some pretty sufficient dew point values regardless, though, and will definitely support quite a lot of instability across this region, especially with those temperatures that are going to be getting into the 90s. So we shouldn't really have too much of a problem with our dew points at the surface, and dew points may even be able to increase here up to the low 70s in very select pocket for southern South Dakota there. Definitely a thing to watch. Again, I definitely have eyes on that dry line bulge there. And you can see it pretty well defined here. It's my lines don't do it justice, but you can definitely see where that dry line bulge is, where we will see a little bit greater forcing along that dry line. But overall, definitely a decently defined dry line. It's not too well defined, and it may be hard for some storms to fire along it. Again, it does look a little bit better on our high resolution ensemble forecast than it does on our ARRR. Our ARRR dry line looks not really the best, but a decent dry line could support some decent storms firing along it. Taking a look at our lapse rates and how that's going to affect our instability and our hail risk, we are expected to see some pretty decently high lapse rate values across this region. Lapse rates that are expected to get upwards of the 7s and even into the 8s in some regions. And those will increase as storms move eastward into North Dakota and or central North Dakota and central South Dakota there. With lapse rates that are going to be a little bit more in the widespread 80s and slowly increase over time. However, overall, where we do have our best risk for severe thunderstorms along the Montana, North Dakota border along that cold front, we will see some decently high lapse rate values. Again, still definitely supportive of some decently strong instability and definitely decently strong hail risk as well, as these lapse rates will expand that layer for hail development and bring it closer down to the ground and allow for some larger hailstones to form. So especially with that very large amount of bulk shear that we saw, again, we are definitely in for a pretty widespread and some pretty widespread and some pretty massive hail across this region, and that's definitely going to be one of the primary risks for today. So I would definitely make sure that you are making sure that you don't drive into any hail cores. If you're a storm chaser out there, you don't have an armored vehicle like the Dominator, I definitely would not suggest core punching, because hailstones are going to be absolutely massive today. However, further down to the south along that dry line bulge, we will see some pretty decently high lapse rate values as well. It doesn't look like they're going to be as high and as high as along that cold front there, but we will definitely see some pretty high, pretty decently strong lapse rate values along that dry line bulge. Lapse rate values expected to get upwards of the 7s. In the mid 7s, which will enhance that instability and enhance that hail risk as well. Taking a look at our cloud cover and how that's going to affect our instability and our overall risk for severe thunderstorms. What we're mainly focusing on here is how much our clouds are going to limit how much light is going to be reaching the surface, and how that's going to affect our temperatures across this region, and in turn affect our instability and our overall risk for severe thunderstorms. So a good thing that we do want to look for, a good rule of thumb, is the thicker the clouds, the less instability that you're going to have with weaker lapse rates and weaker temperatures at the surface. And we primarily are looking at our low-level clouds, which are in blue, and our mid-level clouds, which is in green. Our upper-level clouds can limit a little bit of surface heating. However, it's kind of hard for our mid-level or our high-level clouds to really do too much in limiting surface heating. So we primarily look at our mid-level and our low-level clouds. So one major thing that I'm already noticing here is that we are expected to see large amounts of low-level clouds continue to develop across the Central Plains, particularly further off to the east here in portions of the eastern enhanced risk for northern North Dakota there. Or sorry, not northern North Dakota, but just the entirety of North Dakota, and that extends down across South Dakota and Nebraska. We don't see as thicker cloud cover into South Dakota or Nebraska there, and we may see a little bit more widespread mid-level cloud cover. However, overall, it does look like our mid-level cloud cover is going to be mainly out of the way. We will definitely see a pretty nice clearing, though, across our North Dakota, Montana border region, again, symbolizing where we will see that best risk for severe thunderstorms, where we will see greater surface heating and overall greater instability. However, that instability and our overall risk for severe thunderstorms will definitely be significantly more limited as storms move into that area of thicker cloud cover, because we basically will not see any surface heating, or not as much surface heating as further off to the east. We will see very, very minimal surface heating across eastern portions of the enhanced risk region and the slight risk region. So as storms move into those regions, as they move further east, we will see basically a very low risk for severe thunderstorms as storms exit that enhanced risk region and into the slight risk region. So that's definitely something to note, as we will definitely see some pretty limited limited instability in the sense of where it's going to be limited to. We may see a very small sliver of instability across the high plains as a result of that thicker cloud cover further off to the east. Taking a look at our most unstable cape and how that's going to fuel our severe thunderstorms overall, we are expected to see quite a lot of instability across this region. Again, you can see kind of how it's limited to a little bit more of a small sliver across the high plains and the central plains as a result of that very thick cloud cover further off to the east. However, we will definitely see some pretty sufficient instability values across this region nonetheless, with most unstable cape values across the Montana, North Dakota region that is expected to get upwards of the 1000s and the 2000s and even into the mid and somewhat lower 2000s across that region. We will see a little bit more limited most unstable cape values compared to further down to the south along that dry line bulge, where we will see a little bit more agitation and overall more lift and in turn greater instability, with cape values on our high resolution ensemble forecast that could potentially get upwards of 3000 across the border of Nebraska and southern South Dakota there. Again, another reason why I would chase that dry line bulge is greater instability, greater updrafts, and in turn better risk for severe thunderstorms, especially with pretty sufficient storm relative helicity values. However, regardless, this instability will be more than sufficient across the entire region in fueling the potential for severe thunderstorms and the potential for tornadoes across this region, as well as our various hazards, including the potential for some massive hailstones and the potential for some widespread damaging wind gusts that could be significant. Taking a look at our surface-based cape and our convective inhibition all on the same model, so I can actually show you what the convective inhibition looks like. This area here where you see that that area surrounded by a thick circle and it's dotted, that does indicate a little bit of convective inhibition at the surface. However, this hashed area, this where it's all X'd out, where it's very thick, there is basically completely capped out, and storms will not be able to fire in that region. So we are expected to see a very thick cap across this region before storms do fire. However, that cap will quickly erode when surface heating is introduced and instability begins to strengthen across this region. So that cap across that region, by the time it does break, it will support overall more explosive storms and more explosive risk for the potential of tornadoes, the potential for severe thunderstorms overall, and overall just more explosive updrafts, because there's been something limiting that that rising of heat for basically the entire day before that cap does break. However, it does look like the majority of our surface-based cape is expected, or the majority of our most unstable cape is expected to translate down to our surface, meaning that storms are expected to be surface-based and will have no problem supporting the risk for tornadoes across this region, and we will definitely be able to see some surface-based structures across this region. As far as our convective inhibition goes, in the later half of the day, it does look like by the time our instability does weaken substantially, where our convective inhibition is able to come in and put the cap back in place, it looks like it's kind of just been anxious, been waiting for that cap to be put in place basically all day. And by the time it does get a chance to do that, it will just rush in and cap out the environment across this region. So by the time storms do begin to weaken and we do begin to lose instability, that cap will rush back into place and begin cutting off any storms that are currently ongoing. So we will definitely see a pretty thin sliver for our best risk for severe thunderstorms. In fact, storms will actually have a hard time moving through that convective inhibition in that second half of that enhanced risk region, even after that cap is put back in place. So I wouldn't be surprised if they do shave this area, of the enhanced risk further off to the west a little bit more, kind of looking like this instead, because that convective inhibition will definitely provide some major problems as storms move through the second half of the enhanced risk region. Taking a look at our 0 to 3 kilometer instability and how that's going to aid in fueling our risk for severe thunderstorms. Overall, not really too much going on. does look like we may have some weak 0 to 3 kilometer instability in some areas. However, overall 0 to 3 kilometer instability is going to be basically non-existent across this region. So the lack of that 0 to 3 kilometer instability won't really do too much. However, it's kind of like our defluence on our 200 millibars. If it's there, then it's something to take note of, as it may aid in that risk for severe thunderstorms. However, if it's not there, it's not really too that big of a deal, because we have our instability, most unstable cape, and our surface-based cape that's going to fuel it regardless of our 0 to 3 kilometer instability. Even though our 0 to 3 kilometer instability is definitely a very large aid in supporting the potential for tornadoes across this region, the lack of 0 to 3 kilometer instability, it's not really going to be too much of an impact. Taking a look at our energy helicity index values and how that will indicate the potential for tornadoes across this region, we are expected to see some pretty decently high energy helicity index values across this region, most notably as storms move into more so western North Dakota, then across the Montana North Dakota border. Across that cold front there, definitely see some pretty high energy helicity index values here. Energy helicity index values that are expected to get upwards of 3 to even 4. That is definitely very indicative of even the potential for a significant tornado across this region being possible. And if we look at our soundings here, you can see why. We do have some weaker storm relative velocity values, especially at our 0 to 1 kilometer there, but at our 0 to 3 kilometer, we do have some pretty decently high storm relative velocity values, so we won't have as much storm relative velocity values or that much directional shear, more so at the surface. However, in the entire low level of the atmosphere, we will definitely see some pretty decently high storm relative velocity values, and that will definitely be pretty indicative of the potential for tornadoes across this region. And with some pretty decently strong cape values across this region, upwards of the upper and mid 2000s across this region, that will definitely be supportive of the potential for tornadoes. And our LFC and LCL is a little bit separated from each other there, indicating that we may have a little bit more convective inhibition in place. However, that will definitely lead to some overall better looking storms across this region. It will limit our tornado potential overall. However, shouldn't limit it too much by the time that cap does fully erode, and it is basically fully eroded in this sounding here. However, for the first couple of hours after storms develop and those updrafts really get going, before that cap fully erodes, you could see some insanely nice structure across this region as our updrafts kind of try and force themselves between that little gap there, so it can rise into the rest of the atmosphere. So those force updrafts is what I honestly really like to see. It's really, really pretty to me. It isn't really the best for tornadic development if you're looking for a tornado. However, by the time that cap does fully erode, which it likely would, so maybe even within an hour of that sounding, you will definitely potentially see the potential of a tornado, maybe even a significant tornado across this region. Same goes for further down to the south, as we will have some really high energy helicity index values as well along that dry line bulge, with overall greater storm relative velocity values, especially at the surface there, being indicated by our storm relative velocity values. But we definitely have a really nice curvature in the low levels of the photograph, a very nice low level hump, and overall greater instability values than what was being indicated further off to the north. This sounding is capped out here, so storms aren't expected to fire a little bit further off to the east. However, along that dry line, storms will definitely be able to fire, but storms shouldn't really fire ahead of that dry line because of that environment being capped, and storms will really only be limited to fire along that dry line. Shouldn't really fire off of warmer advection as a result of that cap. Taking a look at our downdraft cape and how that's going to affect our risk for damaging wind gusts across this region, this is kind of like the opposite of cape, where it kind of indicates how strong our downdrafts is going to be. The tendency for air to sink than it is for it to rise with our regular cape. So our downdraft cape is a very good indicator of how strong our downdrafts may be, and in turn how we may see how that may affect our risk for damaging wind gusts, how we may see some widespread damaging wind gusts, and how strong those damaging wind gusts may be. So we have a lot of D-cape across this region. D-cape values upwards of 1,300 across this region as of right now. And in the future, as storms continue to move into this region, they could even potentially increase that DK value, with some pockets even reaching upwards of 1,080 or 800 across portions of western Nebraska. Again, that won't necessarily affect our risk for severe thunderstorms too much, because that will be off to the west. However, it does go to show just the immense amount of sinking air is expected to be across this region associated with these storms. So we are expected to see a lot of decape across this region, and a very big tendency for air to sink in a lot of those downdrafts, and in turn a greater risk for damaging wind gusts. But you could definitely see the potential of damaging wind gusts that could be greater than 70 miles per hour, even 80 miles per hour. And those will definitely be very, very widespread, with very widespread and strong downdraft cape or decape across this region. Taking a look at our hail parameters, keep in mind that this is a good couple of hours before storms actually do move into this region, and before our main event actually starts. You can see where our cold front is by the activity that's currently ongoing. It is further off to the west in central Montana, moving into eastern Montana. Sorry. We do have some decently high large hail parameter values already, upwards of the 20s, that will likely increase as the potential for storms increases and storms actually do move into this region, but already indicating the potential for some large hail with the overlap of our ingredients for large hail. And then for our significant hail parameter, again, it isn't the highest right now because it is hours before storms actually do develop across this region. However, you can see in the future it is expected to increase after our storms do develop to values upwards of 2, which is indicating that potential for significant hail. For our SARS hail size, as of right now, it is only indicating upwards of 2 inches. We can't see into the future with this model. However, it is already indicating the potential for significant hail across this region, with that blue area indicating 2 inches. And that will likely broaden out as storms actually do move into this region. And as far as our SARS significant hail percentage, right now we only do have a 60%. Not sure what these contours are, but we do have a 60% indicated by the lighter green there, and that will likely increase and broaden out more to cover this entire area as storms actually do begin to develop across this region. Now that I've told you the weather, please go down to the description and check out the socials for Project Gladiator, and join the Discord for any updates on Project Gladiator. If you live in any of the areas I covered for today, please stay weather alert for the time being. If you notice anything might have been wrong in this forecast, or you'd like to make a suggestion or ask a question, please leave a comment. 3 other channels I highly suggest you check out are One Nation Weather, Weather Watcher, and JaxonWX. Be sure to wish JaxonWX a happy birthday, because it is his birthday today. Hopefully I'll be able to see you guys tomorrow with another forecast.